Thank you so much, Paul. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful evening. I'm so excited and honored to welcome you to this session with three luminaries of the poetic universe. First, we have Ranjit Hoskote, esteemed writer, poet, art critic, cultural theorist, and curator, to speak of his book, as Paul just mentioned, which is a book on Gieve Patel, who was a renowned poet, painter, playwright, and physician who died last November. So I'd like to call upon Ranjit to launch this book and say a few words about it. And I'd also like to call upon the eminent publisher of the book, Naveen Kishore, the publisher from Seagull Books, and the poet Arundhathi Subramaniam.
Thank you very much, and I now hand over to Anisha to run this session. Thank you.
Would you like to say a few words about the book?
Thank you so much. Paul, it's amazing to see you again after many, many years. It's wonderful. Anisha, thank you for your words of welcome. I just want to very briefly say that Gieve meant a great deal to many of us. He touched so many lives, and he was a friend to actually all the three of us, Arundhathi, Naveen, and to me. Naveen published his collected plays, so that was the playwright part of it. Arundhathi and Gieve had a very long, years-long conversation about his poetry, and Gieve and I connected both as fellow poets, but also really as painter to art critic. So this book is really a collection of 6 essays that I wrote about Gieve's paintings over a 20-year period. And when he passed on, it was, it's one of those moments of reckoning when you realize how abundantly present he had been. I mean, for me, it was a recollection of many, many occasions of being together, conversations, advice from him to me, responses from me to him about his work. So that's the spirit in which these essays are presented, with a new personal essay as the introduction. So the essays themselves are acts of what I like to think of as a humane criticism, not abstract, cold, theoretical, but something that addresses the muscle and the pulse of the artwork. And the essay is a way of thinking back to nearly 40 years of our friendship. We knew each other for 37 years. So the book is really an offering and remembrance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjit. So let's get started now with our session. So I'll first introduce Arundhathi Subramaniam. Arundhathi is the award-winning author of 14 books of poetry and prose, including the recent volume, Love Without a Story, and a book of essays on contemporary women on sacred journeys, titled Women Who Wear Only Themselves. Her other work includes the acclaimed sacred poetry anthology, Eating God, and the best-selling biography of a mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life. A well-known prose writer in Indian spirituality, she has been a long-standing arts critic, anthologist, performing arts curator, and poetry editor. Arundhathi's latest book, Wild Women, Seekers, Protagonists, and Goddesses in Sacred Indian Poetry, is a poetry anthology on the female presence in Indian mystic poetry. This book, she says, can be read as a manual on how to walk that windswept path between faith and improvisation, veil and nakedness, identity and erasure by women whose language is, and how could it be otherwise, poetry. Arundhathi would love for you to read from Wild Women and your other work as well.
Thank you, Anisha. Can I be heard? Yes. So, Wild Women, as Anisha points out, is a book of crazy, ecstatic, truly rapturous and lunatic women. And women of very diverse spiritual contexts, women of very diverse points in chronology, But what, to my mind, brings them all together, whether they're the Buddhist nuns or the Vaishnava mystics or the Shaiva devotees or the Sufis, what brings them all together is this great ravenous appetite for a more profound experience of life itself. And as I started putting this book together, it became for me just a way of reclaiming the ancestors I have longed for a very long time. Ancestors, foremothers, role models, sisters, not just meek followers, but pioneers in their own right. I'd like to read 4 short poems from the book. I'll start with Mutta, who is a Buddhist nun who speaks to us from over 2,500 years ago, translated by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. And her words reach us as if they were written today. So freed, so thoroughly freed am I from 3 crooked things set free, from mortar, from pestle, and crooked old husband, having uprooted the craving that leads to becoming, I'm set free from aging and death. It's a poem of outer and inner freedom, and that very same thread of freedom is picked up again and again down the centuries. And I'd like to move to a 14th century Dalit woman mystic who asks these amazing questions about menstruation, about ideas of ritual purity and pollution. Quite a dangerous voice. Soirabai, translated by Neela Bhagwat and Jerry Pinto. You say some bodies are untouchable. Tell me what you say of the soul. You say defilement is born in the body. If menstrual blood makes me impure, tell me who was not born of that blood. This blood of mine fertilizes the world. Tell me who has not sprung from that source. Soira says, this impurity is the cornerstone of your world. That's why I praise only Panduranga, who lives in every body, pure, impure. These are not just poems of outer freedom, not just poems celebrating cultural and social freedom. They're also poems of ecstatic self-discovery. And so here is Rupa Bhavani, the 17th century Kashmiri mystic, translated by Nirja Mattu. I have not bowed, I never will. The one who listens is resplendent within me. I have not bowed, I never will. The one who listens is resplendent within me. That is worship. That's what I do. And I'll conclude this round with a poem by Janabai, who was a 13th century Marathi woman mystic, a maidservant. We know her caste and class antecedents, and yet this is probably one of the most audacious voices that I've heard in mystic literature. And here she is, translated by Arun Kolatkar. She's amazing for this utterly jaunty, backslapping relationship of intimacy with her personal god, Vitthala. I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here, God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within, God is without. And moreover, there's God to spare. With that note of surplus sacredness, thank you.
Thank you, Arundhati. That was beautiful. Especially, I like the last poem. It was very visceral. Really liked it. Thank you. Okay, next we have Ranjit Hoskote, who is a poet, of course, a cultural theorist, curator, archivist, and writer for museums, galleries, and biennales across the globe. His 6 collections of poetry include Vanishing Act, Central Time, and Jonah Whale. His translation of a celebrated 14th century Kashmiri woman saint's poetry has appeared as I Lalla, the Poems of Lal Ded. Of Ranjit's latest book, a reviewer has said, in Icelight, Ranjit Hoskote thinks by way of the heart, which is, of course, how good poetry is made. A deeply felt reflection on the ecological crisis that is at once spiritual and political, this collection of poems, Hoskote's 8th, bears witness to the slow death of our planet. I call upon Ranjit to read from Icelight and his other work.
Thank you so much, Anisha. I think I'll pick up the thread from where you left it off, Arundhati. I was amazed. I didn't realize Gieve Patel was in the anthology. So I'm going to read. I'll begin with a Vak from Lal Ded, Lalla, who I translated. And I thought maybe we could hear her voice through mine. Ami pansodaras navichaslaman katibozide meun metidi tar amin takin ponzan shaman zuv chumbraman garagatsa. I'm towing my boat across the ocean with a thread. Will he hear me and help me across? Or am I seeping away like water from a half-baked cup? Wonder, my poor soul, you're not going home anytime soon. The kernel of this corpus of sacred verse was composed really in the 14th century, but as I've argued in this book, it has been added to continually down the centuries by anonymous contributors writing under the signature of the original teacher. And so the Vaks have a variety of tonalities. They are always premised on seeking that which is larger than oneself, but that comes through humor, sarcasm, devotion, anger, love, ecstasy, a whole range of emotional states. And remember that at the core of this tradition stands a woman who had to leave her home to be a quester, to seek herself, because the tradition she came from was premised on male householders. And so you have someone who is deeply confluential, someone who, as Lal Arifa, has meaning and presence in a Sufi Islamic context, as Laleshwari has a presence in a Pandit Hindu context. So it grieves me greatly to see how in these last 20 or 25 years, people have been wrangling over who she was originally. I think it is important that we embrace her in her versionality, in the way in which she can mean different things to different people. And I'm going to read another of my translations of one of her Vaks, because here and there you have the voice of someone who struggled. There isn't very much immediate biography in the Vaks, but in verses like these you hear it. What the books taught me, I've practiced. What they didn't teach me, I've taught myself. I've gone into the forest and wrestled with the lion. I didn't get this far by teaching one thing and doing another. And I'll read a couple of poems from Icelight, as you requested, Anisha. The poem that opens the book is called Teset, which many of you will recognize as a musical instruction, urging the practitioner to pause. So I thought it might be amusing to open a book with an instruction saying, pause, think about silence. Teset. She stood under a drizzle of copper leaves, mouth opened in a hymn of praise, voice Teset, only the chirping of sparrows heard on the terrace above the sleeping town. Be opaque, her sisters had said, because this crust is what will get you through. Standing above the chasm opened in the eastern rock, she thought, what if there was no border between flesh and light? What if I had no skin? Of what am I the barometer? And I'll read one called Witness. Speak, earth, in constellations of dewbud and darkening ray, turning to coal and slate in the cold mine shaft, where I laid my hand on cryptic passages carved from tidal night, while voices hurried through the locked air. Men with sharpened arrows, look for him. I've found the seedbed, earth. I wait for you to say, it's time. Let me tell you why you're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjit. And next we have Naveen Kishore. Naveen established Seagull Books in 1982 as a publishing program in the arts and media, focusing on drama, film, art, and cultural studies. Today, it also publishes literature, including poetry and serious fiction, and owns the worldwide English language publishing rights for books by Paul Celan, Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Bernhard, and Ma Shweta Devi, among many others. As a poet, Naveen has made his mark with the publication of 2 books of poems. Says a reviewer of his book, latest book, Mother Muse Quintet, Mother Muse Quintet is more than just an ode to the memory of a mother. It is a recognition of beauty in fragility, glory in defiance, refuge in silence, and calm in chaos. Naveen, we would love for you to read from Mother Muse Quintet and some of your other work.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm known to mumble, so scream if you don't hear me clearly. In this round, I won't be reading, forgive me, from poetry, but I will be exploring from a longer essay on the nature of the muse, the nature of the poetic. The relationship that a shadow has with the sun, their playfulness, ebb and flow depending on the nature of the sundial, the position of the sun, the role that clouds choose to play, the shape and size of the surfaces the shadow may traverse in deliberation or accident, the agility or its lack of the shadow-bearing being, and the angle in which the sun may caress their bodily selves will often decide the fate of the shadow. Sundrian, a point of no return where the almost violent breaking apart of a single thought, a sundering into oppositional halves, or a scattering into infinite pieces causes an upheaval, a disturbance, both apparently negative words, but do not be fooled into denying them virtue. The placid needs to be visited by its opposite for language to find utterance, particularly in poetry. The ebbing of shadows, like the receding memory of a newborn plucked from a fast disappearing world, one that you cannot return to, shadowless by nature and yet safe with, within, and even in nature, as is perhaps the nature of the womb. Even as they flow into a newness from the moment of the first cry, begins to gather, assimilate the noise of the world. Driftwood that would soon find utterance as language in time, and in time, the drift that suggests the random will begin to appear as tightly knit, word filled with meaning. The birth of a new memory is also the moment of no return. This time of almost limbo between these two worlds, one where the erstwhile is still in the process of erasing itself, and the newborn memory has yet to make its presence felt, is in fact the moment most fertile for poetry. The nature of the poetic, a hesitant tango between the erstwhile and the unfolding of the immediate, the apparently real and the magnetism of that which is imagined. Text that resides in the image and finds a way to be born, even born. Nothing is redundant. Every bit of memory returns in one form or the other to allow the poet insight into the nature of the poetic. Insight, implying an inward seeing, turning inwards towards a hidden choice of words, an almost involuntary, intuitive drawing of breath and giving it language, like a sign that lasts or an echo that has found its voice, an exhilaration drawing its inspiration from an inner melancholy. This unique and individual voice is what matters, one that derives inspiration from one's passion, the kind that resides in the heart. No amount of skill and artifice can achieve this singularity of voice, a strength gained from silence, almost a courage that allows the poet to bear witness to one's own conscience. Often this is experienced as suddenly as the unexpected. The nature of that which is not expected is sudden, like driving down a mountain steepness and suddenly hitting the brake at an unexpected curve, finding yourself hurtling towards a real abyss, not just the imagined one. In those few seconds of near death, you rethink an entire life, involuntary and unexpected, causing an upheaval of immensity. Your car skids to a halt and you breath all over the steering wheel. This moment of rebirth is located within the nature of poetry. This immediacy of what Pascal Quignard calls the afterwards, or suddenly afterwards, actually finds vocabulary of the poetic. Elegies, the poet as a grieving being, one who suffers as she records, the paradox of simultaneously being at a loss for words, as in watching helplessly the demise of a loved one, in this case our burning planet, and being full to the brim with grief that has no choice but to pour over and find vocabulary. Imagine our situation when the sheer exhilaration of innocence can no longer be easily expressed. We're all compromised in our bystanding. I let it happen. The virtue of upheaval and disturbance in any act of creativity. Churn memory, yours and mine, the role of memory, the role that luck plays in contextualizing the meaning into both the particular, as in this line in your poem speaks to me, and the universal, a collective chord that rings both in your head when you write that line, and mine as a reader who recognizes my moment of synchronicity with the thought that is the kind of poetic luck one aspires to. Befriending loneliness as a writerly being. Thank you.
Thank you, Naveen. I think that was a very profound kind of meditation on the poetic process. So thank you so much for that. So I think since we've all come here to hear poetry, I think it would be lovely if we could have another round of readings from each of our poets. So I call on Arundhathi to read first.
I thought I'd read this time from my recent book of essays, which is punctuated by poems. It's a book called Women Who Wear Only Themselves. And it's about 4 contemporary women on sacred journeys that are utterly diverse. One is on the path of Tantra, one on the path of Bhakti, one on the path of Yoga, all completely diverse. I'm going to read a couple of poems from the book. The first is called Textile. Some days, nothing in your wardrobe satisfies. Not the heat-maddened ikkats, not the secular pastels. There's no season you can call your own. Like others, you wait in queues for the drought to end. Although you know everything there is to know about the guile and the gristle of the heart, its handloom desires, its spandex fantasies, its polycot, its wear and tear polytheism. And you know that when it finally happens, the whoosh of textile, versatile, block printed by sun, it will feel big enough to put an end to all the throbbing questions forever. But the winters, they get colder each time. And so you return reluctantly to digging through the stretch and seam and protest of tattered muscle, deeper into the world's oldest fabric, deeper into the darkening, widening meritocracy of the heart. It's always difficult to know what poem to read next, especially when you're only reading 2 poems. So maybe I'll read a poem called Tongue, which is a poem that has an epigraph by John Berger, who says, "The tongue is alone and tethered in its mouth." The man in front of me is reading a balance sheet. He is smiling, his gaze shimmying between columns, effortlessly bilingual. And though a little drunk on the liquor of profit, I like to believe he is not immune to the sharp beauty of integers simmering with their own inner life. And I wonder whether he feels the way I do sometimes around words, waiting for them to lead me past the shudder of taproot, past the inkiness of groundwater, to those places where all tongues meet. Calculus, Persian, cockbarock, flamenco, the tongue that sparrows know, and accountants, and those palm trees at the far end of holiday photographs. Your tongue, mine. The kiss that knows from where the first songs sprang, forested and densely plural. The kiss that knows no separation. This is about one of the women in the book. There are some times when a person doesn't lend themselves to prose and you turn to poetry. So this is a naked woman mystic whom I met in southern India, who took my breath away with the way she wore her body. The lover. The woman doesn't call herself a saint, just a lover of a saint who's been dead 300 years. She doesn't see people on weekdays, but her master tells her we're safe. So she calls us in to where she sits, her body blazing in its nakedness, a crumpled afterthought. Its tummy fold and breast sag and wild spiraling nipple, reminding us that life is circles, crazy, looping, involuting, dazzling circles. She tells us the world called her a whore. She told her master about it too, but he only said, the rest of the world serves many masters: family, money, lovers, bosses, fame, power, money, in endless carousels. The crazy autopilot of samsara. But you, love, think only of me. Who's the whore here? Outside the window, the sun is a red silk lampshade over a great soiled bedspread, ricocheting in the wind.
I'll start with one called Eclipse. You waited all night for the eclipse. A panther loped down to the lake and swallowed the moon. Another night, you thought the wind had called for truce. The moon never crossed the laterite border. A third night, searching in this field where the sky had rained stars, you found the moon buried in a furrow that a yoked bull had measured in loops from left to right to left, turning and returning. Speak, lunatic angel, which was the right way? Was I implement or impediment? All night the eclipse waited for you. I'll move on to one called Krishna's End. Now this is an episode from the epics that I've been fascinated by since I was a child, really. What does it mean? The drowning of a city, the death of a god, the way in which things from previous lives catch up with you. It seems like a good way of thinking about ecological crisis, especially if, as I do, you live in a city that is certain to drown in 15 years. Krishna's End. Gurgle of rising waters, the tide is right, cries of gulls you thrash through sludge to stay in the dance. Stay, slay, let go the blade, take the arrowhead aimed at your heel, falter, fall, struggle to your feet in the forest of the gods as it sinks. Virama, the lock on your abujada tongue breaks. You find it in you to pause and praise again. The currents rush through and past you, stirring up white waves. You pluck stories, let go. Touch lives, let go. Hoot, screech, roar, whisper, ask forgiveness, forgive. Discover again every voice that spoke through you. And now you lose your voice. Your wound tells you what must be done. One last look back at the fading mangroves beyond which the city you ruled till an hour ago is burning. You slip into the weighted canoe. The tide is ripe. And I'll finish with a poem called Return. Open your eyes to this rain that's here to stay. Centuries from now, hurtling through space, this planet will host night fog and day haze on screens where once our lamplit faces had flickered until they'd grown too hard to love. In the intervals when time reminds itself how unbearable it is to keep calm and carry on, swelling the dark rivers that will churn and wash through our ruined cities, every staircase and escher cart, this rain. The far ship is a house marooned among scudding clouds, without captain or crew or faintest hope of landfall, all horizons hostile, all compass points lost. A seagull losing height over snowy peaks, you call out in a world muted by mist, so mortal that the autumn trees would cloak you in their final leaves as you stumble towards the latched gate. Out of breath traveler, stammering a word of thanks, light returns to the world. Thank you.
This one's from Mother Muse Quintet. She carried crumbs every single morning, the smell of bread every single morning, for as long as I can remember, for as long as she can remember. She never forgot to scatter the crumbs in every conversation, like puzzles or clues, to help her find her way home later, much later, when the mist from over there would begin to rise, stretch out, start to take charge, like the inevitable damp, cling to things in and around her. Then, those scattered clues, like markers in a treasure hunt, those planted hints, they were the advance guard in a war that would surely take place. But in her innocence, she had failed to realize that the first casualty would be the power lines, short-circuited. The enemy would cut off her ability to recognize, to recall her master plan, to recognize the very signs she had so diligently left in place. Now they were part of a geography lesson, a map of an alien landscape of her own making. This one's also from Mother Muse. Persuade breath, stop, pull back hands, cajole, plead, clock, turn time, stop time, or at least pause time, take stock, halt time, whatever it is that clocks do to bring back that one moment. Slam shut the door on fingers made numb so I may feel pain, grieve a little longer, distract time. Step back, move sideways and forward, anything, confuse time. Images of a childhood spent in patches of sunlight, gathering pebbles, while adults hatch plans of shooting photos on agfas from another time to bring back that one moment. Capture, trap, still time. Remind, rewind, playback, payback time. Signs of growing up crisscross an entire landscape, moving in the opposite direction. What could we do? What could we do to take stock, halt time? Whatever it is that clocks do to bring back that one single moment of sunlight as you stand aslant the shadows, counting hours, spit on stones and polish them with your 7-year-old hands, filling pockets with as many as you can gather. Way down time from another time. Cajole, plead, clock, don't stop time. Grieve, stay still as the shadows move the hands of the clock. Pause, stop, distract, step back, move sideways and upwards, images of an adulthood you left behind. Bring back that one moment, this one time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
So there's like this narrative around poetry that we also talked about yesterday, where it's like this possessed state that the poet is in, or something that's almost inherent to some people. So I was curious about, as poets, what are your guys' relationship with poetry? Like, do you think it's something that's always been inherent to you? Is it like this external divine being that lets you eat it sometimes? Or is it like a skill that you decide to acquire and then like cricket or football, you're able to sort of learn it? Like, how does that work? Where does poetry come from? It's a little bit of a rant than a question, but thank you so much.
What a question. Where does poetry come from? I mean, it comes from the same place that an inspired meal comes from. When you sit and cook a fabulous meal, all these things come from mysterious places. There's magic and there's manual labor, and both are important. You can't have one without the other. So I'm very uncomfortable when people do away with the magic of poetry, but I'm also uncomfortable when people do away with the craft that is an integral part of the poetic process.
Would you like to respond? No? Okay. Yes.
So I have a question. If there is no definition of poetry, in fact, I wrote to Greenwich Book of World Record for establishing a world record. Then they set up a committee and then replied that 2 line can be a poetry and 20 line can also be a poetry, 200 line also poetry. So there is no definition of poetry. So we cannot go for any record in poetry because it is not quantifiable. So is there any definition of poetry?
Is there a question? That's more of an observation.
It's more a rhetoric question.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other questions? No? Okay. Do we have time for more reading, or I think we're running out of time. Sure. So one last poem each.
One option is that we conclude with one poem each, but if you're all tired, we'll stop now and we'll head to the author's lounge.
One poem.
One poem each?
One poem, yes.
Okay. I thought I'd conclude with this poem that is about mothers. I don't know how many of you have felt this. I think everyone has had a moment that's some kind of equivalent in their lives. One grows up thinking about parents as the backdrop to one's life. And suddenly there's a moment when one swivels around and realizes that the backdrop is actually a person, a human being in her own right. When landscape becomes woman. I was 8 when I looked through a keyhole and saw my mother in her hibiscus silk sari, her fingers slender around a glass of iced cola. And I grew suddenly shy for not having seen her before. I knew her well, of course, serene undulation of blue malmal, wrist serrated by thin gold bangle, the gentle convexity of mole on upper right arm, and her high, arched feet, better than I knew myself. And I knew her voice like running water, ice cubes in cola. But through the keyhole at the grown-up party, She was no longer geography. She seemed to know just when to incline her neck, just how to sip her swirly drink, and she understood the language of baritone voices and lacquered nails and words like emergency. I could have watched her all night. And that's how I discovered that keyholes always reveal more than doorways, that a chink in the wall is all you need to tumble into a parallel universe, that mothers are women.
I would have read that, but I think I'm going to read. All three of us have been preoccupied with four mothers, ancestral presences, but also with our own mothers. I'm going to again respond to what Naveen read earlier, what you've read. So this is an elegy for my mother. Bookmark for Amma. The world is everything that is the case and was. Would the world be everything that was 3 weeks, 7 months, a year ago the case? You took the sun with you, left behind just a dull shade of bright, a trail of sloughed skin, a casing. Let no one think the world is everything that is the case. From 60 years ago, your notes in the margins of your Keats, is that the case? Your hazel eyes closed, the last thing you asked me, do the parrots still nest in the tree outside your window? A question I'll never hear again, but there's the tree, every leaf aflame, the parrots flying around it in green garlands. Is that the case?
I never thought I'd read from a phone. This one was written after I read Icelight, sent it to Ranjit. But it kind of makes sense for all poets. A lifetime spent in the wilderness of language, the poet returned to sing his song, bringing with him a handful of dark earth, a seed the size of a fingernail, and a flute made of the finest bamboo. He carefully planted the seed in the earth, picking up his flute, the one that was made of the finest bamboo. He began to play. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everybody. Thank you so much for joining us.